Welcome to the Sounds of the World. We are your hosts, Hillary and Bill.
Together, we're going to travel around the world to discover new music, discuss musical topics, and interview fascinating people.
Our world is a buffet of music, and it is time to eat. Our guest today comes to us from New York. He's currently a professor of music composition at Fredonia School of Music. Today, we're going to talk to him about his work towards equality and representation for composers around the world. He is the founder and director of the Institute of Composer Diversity and is a big proponent for equal representation for living composers. Today, we're going to talk to him about his amazing new endeavors, what organizations can do to encourage the performance and representation of living composers, as well as discover who the man is behind the humorous and informative Twitter feeds. Please welcome Rob Deemer.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here, sir. Really appreciate it. It's great to finally kind of talk to you face to face rather than via email or Facebook Instant Messenger.
We're really excited to have you today. So thanks for agreeing to be on our show.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about maybe your previous, your youth and your background, maybe your musical background.
Sure. So I grew up in Northern Illinois, in DeKalb, Illinois, which is about an hour and a half west of Chicago, out in the cornfields. And for the longest time, I thought I was going to be a high school band director. So I studied music education at NIU. And even though I thought I was going to be a high school band director, I thought, I'd loved arranging big band charts when I was in high school. And then I took some arranging classes in college. And one thing led to another. And I basically just discovered that I liked writing music and that people thought I was pretty good at it. And so at that point, and this was in the early 90s, I never really ever thought that I would be like a concert composer, like someone who'd be writing symphonies and string quartets and all of that. But the idea of writing film music was something that I was like, oh, that's something I could imagine, because my concept of what a composer was back in the day was a little bit like, Mozart. All composers had to start when they were 6, and here I was like, in my early 20s, and I'm like, well, I must have missed that bus. So
you missed the window. That was it.
How could I possibly be a composer? I'm too old. I missed the boat. So I figured, well, I love to go out to Los Angeles and be a film composer. So basically, I graduated. I spent a year on a cruise ship playing saxophone every night.
Wow.
In order to get enough money to at least get things started so I could attend the film scoring program out at the University of Southern California. And then I moved out to Los Angeles, lived there for 3 years, and discovered a few things. First, I loved scoring films, which was really a lot of fun. I also discovered that I really didn't like the idea of being a freelancer, which unfortunately, if you're going to be a film composer, there's not really any salaried gigs with something like that. So, especially in the mid 90s. So I kind of been like, okay, well, that's an issue. I also discovered that I missed teaching, and, I missed being around education. And I just remembered thinking that I missed being on a college campus and all of those things. And so I started thinking maybe I should go back to grad school, because at that point I was like, oh, what do I need grad school for? But the final thing that I discovered was that up until that point, I'd never actually taken a composition lesson before. I was completely self-taught.
Oh, wow.
And I was having fun, but you get to that point where you're like, I should know how to do that, and I don't know how to do that. Or you come to the edge of your the boundaries on the map, and you're kind of like, I should probably go actually learn how to be a composer maybe. And so I decided to go back, do my master's back at Northern Illinois University, actually because I was like, I already know those folks and they know me, but I also didn't know whether or not I wanted to be a composer or conductor. So I basically, so I did both. I actually did a master's in composition and a performer's certificate in conducting over the course of 3 years. Got to work with the wind ensemble there and the Philharmonic, and it was wonderful. And I finally made the decision within those 3 years that I would rather be a composer who conducted rather than a conductor who composed. For many reasons, as I'm sure you can imagine. And then I decided to go do my doctorate down at the University of Texas at Austin. And so I was there for 4 years and got a chance to not only learn a lot about contemporary music, which I was a jazzer back when I was in high school and in undergrad, and I was a saxophone player. So I never really grew up with like your traditional Bach, Beethoven, Brahms type musical background. And so, I was kind of trying to catch up with that, and then learning all of these contemporary living composers. I worked with a new music ensemble there at UT Austin, and so that was fun. And then one thing led to another, and 2 weeks before I graduated, I found myself getting a year-long thing kind of filling in for a position at the University of Oklahoma. So I went and taught there for a year. And then that job was only a year. And so then I found myself going, now what do I do? I'm here. Right. I'm in Oklahoma. I have no idea what I'm going to do. I finally ended up getting some adjunct work at Oklahoma City University. But I also had this idea of like, I've always wanted to get into radio. I've always wanted to do radio. And so I just had this idea of like, why don't I create a radio show? And so I did. It was called The Composer Next Door, and the folks at Central Oklahoma University, which is where the NPR station is there in Oklahoma, agreed to let me do a radio show. And so I did that for like 2.5 years. I was in Oklahoma for a year, and then I got the gig at Fredonia, and then kept doing it for about a year after that. And it was fun because I was just emailing everybody under the sun and be like, you don't know who I am, but I'm Rob Deemer. I'm here in Oklahoma, and I'd love to play your music on my radio show. And everyone's like, okay, here's... These people, everybody would be sending me these CDs, and it was great. It was wonderful, and it was a way for me to be able to start to get to know who's out there. And I think it, to tag on to what we'll probably be talking about later, is that the broader the window was that I started to know what was out there, the better the picture was, right? Because so often we tend to know our own little circles, and we have our own little biases and experiences, and that's how we know what the world is. But then over time, you meet more composers, you hear about more composers, and then it just kind of goes from there. And that radio show kind of forced me to learn who was out there, because one of the things I wanted to do with the radio show was to feature composers all across the country. So I would be like, okay, who are the composers who are in Montana and in Wyoming and in, South Dakota and all of these folks, and Alabama and all of these states that we don't normally associate with having a thriving new music scene.
Right.
And that was just a lot of fun to kind of get a sense of who the composers were all across the country. And so that idea of kind of advocating for living composers and trying to make sure that people knew who was out there and getting a sense of that. So that kind of goes back quite a ways, 2007 that I was starting to do that. So then I was teaching here at Fredonia. I started here in 2007. And as you do, I was still composing and teaching and all of this stuff. And I started, had this idea, which it is never actually seen fruition yet, but I had this idea of going and interviewing all of these composers, and I ended up interviewing about 150 composers back in the day. And this was before we all had a lot of podcasts and the idea I was just literally, I'd fly to New York City and I would like trudge around with my bag with like a little, recording device. And I had a bunch of questions, and I would sit there and talk with folks for 2 or 3 hours. And then I would like go jump on a subway and go up to the Upper East Side and talk to someone else. And I would do that I did that for like a year and a half.
Wow.
And I got again another chance to be able to meet people, and when I happened to run into them, I would do these interviews. And so as I was doing that, I met the folks at New Music Box, which is the online magazine with New Music USA. And they asked me hey, would you be interested in writing a short column every week? And so then I did that for 3 years. And you see how these things, they're just kind of one accident after another. I've literally just been like tripping and stumbling throughout my entire career.
Yeah. But they're all building onto each other. So.
Oh, and they do. And there is a point to it. I told you that to tell you this. But in 2013, after writing these things for a couple of years, there was a conversation that was happening in March of 2013 where folks were trying to they were discussing the idea of whether or not women composers should be thought of as women composers or just composers, right? And there's so many reasons why on both sides.
Right.
And of course, me being not a woman composer, I'm like, I'm not going to get into that. There is no room for me in that conversation. However, because of all of these adventures that I'd had, I knew a lot of composers. I knew at least who they were, if not knew them personally. So I just came up with a list, and it's still out there on New Music Box. It's called a helpful list, and it's basically just a list of 200. I think 201, because of course you couldn't just have an even 200.
Of course,
201 women composers, and hyperlinked to their website. And one of the things that I did was I mentioned that the reason why I did that was because I'd heard from so many people that over the years that they wanted to be able to perform more works by women composers or by other composers that were outside of the normal canon, but they just didn't know how to find it. Like there wasn't like easy way for them to discover that. And so I thought, great, so I'll do that. Easy cheesy. Little did I know. So I had no idea what I was getting myself in, on so many levels. So the comment section of that post.
Oh no.
So many. Well, no, the cool thing is that so many people were like, "Oh, you need to know this composer and this composer and this composer."
Oh, cool.
There's like 400 plus composers in the comments section.
Wow.
Which is amazing. I was like, "Oh, this is so cool." I'm learning who all these people are. And I remember after it came out, I'm like, I should go through and I should just like put those, and do something with that. Fast forward 3 years. So that was in 2013. 2016. I had a summer before a year-long fellowship that I was doing at Baldwin Wallace University. And so I was going to be living by myself. My wife's still up here in Fredonia. I was going to be down in Cleveland, and I basically had time in my hands. So I'm like, what would be cool? I will go back to that article with that thing that I've been meaning to do for like 3 years, and I'll like put all of these composers into a spreadsheet as a project for my students here at Fredonia. Because I felt, it's really important for them to know who these composers are, and for them to be able to both not only for my female students, but also for my male students. They need to know who's out there, and to make sure that start the slow, arduous process of normalizing that. Like, it should not be like, oh, this is like a super special thing. No, there's a bunch of them out there. You just don't know who they are. You don't know where to find them. So, boom. So as I was putting that spreadsheet together, again, I was like, what if I ... and then and then I was like, wait, the problem with these lists, and there were other lists out there at the time, that I was already aware of, where it was basically lists of composers and maybe their websites and maybe a little bit about them, but usually just kind of like, here's, it's kind of like Wikipedia, here's all these folks.
Mm-hmm.
And basically I was like, it'd be good is if you could isolate your search by different filters. There's a book written by David Daniels called Orchestral Music that most conductors use as a really good tool, and it's great because it's basically just a big reference book, and you can go through and you can find all of the different works by Beethoven and Ravel and whatnot, and it lists like who the publisher is and the duration and the instrumentation and maybe some program notes. But it's great because in the back of the book you can go, do you need a work with between 5 and 10 minutes long for an instrumentation like X? Here and then have a list of all of the works. So I had experience with this book, so I'm like, that's what could be useful, where you can be like, what if you could find a composer, not just here's a list of women composers, but the composers who've written operas or have written for wind band or have written for choir or whatnot. And then I'm like, well, let's see, what are the other things that people are going to look for? They're going to look for whether or not they're living or historical, location, whether or not a particular city or a state or a different country, and then also demographics,
right?
And so that's what I did for like a year and a half, in the middle of 2016 through the end of 2017, and at that point, I think I had like 2,800 composers in this Google spreadsheet, which was janky as all hell.
And that was mostly female composers?
It was entirely female composers. It was the Women Composers Database. I actually launched it as like, here's the Women's Composers Database at the end of 2017. And basically I was just kind of like, okay, it's not done, but it's kind of like, here's what we have so far, and all of the information is right. And I even remember, even back then, people were yelling at me. They're like, what do you mean it's done? I was like, it's not done. It's not like if you're not in it, you don't ever get in.
That's it. You had your shot. Goodbye. Just stop.
Okay. So,
no, it was now and you're gone.
Little did I know that I look back and go, oh, that's cute. Oh, Deemer, you should have known. It would get worse. So that happened, and people seemed to like it, and it seemed to be useful. And so I'm like, okay, well, the next thing that I want to do is I want to be able to. At that point, I was having some of my students here at Fredonia. They were doing they were helping out with independent studies by helping to put this together.
Oh, cool.
And basically I was like, okay, well, the next thing we need to do is we need to go find all of the male composers of color, so that then it could be, instead of just women composers database, it could be a little bit more comprehensive and have all the composers of color, because it already had all the female composers of color, just have the males. And so we did that over the next six months or so. And then we also had some friends help me put together an initial website, and then we called it the Composer Next Door. That was my radio show. Composer Diversity Database, and I was lucky enough to get the website. Then so we launched that in June of 2018. And basically it was literally just being able to search for composers using all of these different filters. So you have this large list of 3,500 or whatever it was, composers, and then to be able to filter it down. So you could only had to look through, 50 composers at a time, as opposed to all of those different composers. And then fast forward another 6 months, and at that point, enough people had told me, you need to you're trying to do all of this yourself with some help from your colleagues here at Fredonia. And so then I'm like, okay, So what we'll do is I knew if I was going to be bringing people on, I was going to have to find a way to provide them with at least some financial assistance.
Right.
And so I went to the university here, State University of New York at Fredonia, where I'm teaching, and asked them if we could start the Institute for Composer Diversity. And I've had a lot of people ask me, why did you pick that name? And it wasn't to try and make it seem bigger than it was, but I knew I knew from my experiences on my fellowship and just in general that it would be better, rather than trying to do fundraising every year, if we could find someone affiliated with the university or just out in the world who would be interested in maybe endowing it, to donate the money, put their name on it, and then you could then it's not like it's a money making thing, but it's some way that you can help, you can provide resources for the folks who are helping you and not have to do all of that. So that was my main thought in terms of why I called it that. And at that point I already decided that I was never actually going to take any salary or stipend from it, but it's just there for me to be able to provide folks who are helping with that.
Yeah, that was actually one thing I was going to ask you about, was about you not getting paid, because I saw the interview you had with African composers.
Oh yeah,
and it was interesting, that dichotomy, but we can get back to that.
Oh, yeah. We have many rabbit holes to go down, but I'll try and finish my long-winded kind of description to get us to the present day. So we basically started the Institute officially in January of 2019, and then over the last almost 2 years now, it's kind of shifted and morphed a little bit based on who was helping. It now has a number of different initiatives, including both the Composer Database and Works Database, which currently allows for you to be able to search for wind band music, orchestra music, and art song music. And we're currently building a choral database and a chamber database. And when those things are finally up and running, it should be quite useful for the musical community writ large. We also, because I didn't have enough to do, I suppose, I decided at the beginning of 2019, I decided to analyze the upcoming seasons for the 1920 season of 120 orchestras around the country, and put that analysis up on the website. And that got a fair amount of notice from folks in the orchestra community, because they're like, who is this guy? And why is he
analyzing us?
These numbers that don't make us look very good, and or did make us look very good.
Right.
They, kind of came out of nowhere. So the idea of using of providing resources like the databases plus analysis, and then also advocacy in terms of programming, and we'll get into this in terms of all of why it is what it is, but those are kind of the three things in terms of what we've been trying to do, is to give folks tools to do better, give folks analysis, partially just to show them what the world is in terms of programming these days, and then also advocacy just in terms of trying to convince folks, hey, this is something that you can do. And when I say this, I specifically mean I'm gearing it towards folks who are programming: conductors, performers, educators, classical music hosts, scholars, anyone who's deciding what repertoire goes where in a live concert or in a book or whatnot, for them to be able to broaden their horizon and to provide access to them to discover the works that they may not have discovered otherwise. And so that's the kind of advocacy that we've been kind of kind of pushing for in terms of trying to get performers and conductors and the folks who are programming to think about their process in a different way. And I think that's probably a good place for me to kind of put a button on that and then let you that with other questions. I'm sure I it was a bit long-winded, but it did give you kind of a clear picture of like, how did this guy who was like playing baritone saxophone and writing big band charts back in the late 80s and early 90s end up doing what he's doing now? I don't know, but it's happened.
I remember hearing about the computer diversity database, composer, sorry, not computer, through Jennifer Jolly and Andrew overall, also at Fredonia. And so I was like, what's going on here? And I think I emailed a link that they had sent, and I was like, talk to you about like how you divide it all up. And you sent me one of those early spreadsheets. And I was just like, oh my goodness, I can already see this is going to get big, and it's going to get big fast.
Yeah, it was interesting because when I didn't intend to create what I did, but it seemed like what would be useful that doesn't currently exist. And then it just kind of grew organically from there. And the challenge with that is that when you let something grow organically and not necessarily like with a laser point goal in terms of it must be like this narrow, and it can be a challenge sometimes to keep it on track. Like it wants to veer left, it wants to veer right, and all of these things, and kind of trying to keep hold of the tiger by the tail, so to speak, has been challenge, but at the same time it's also engendered a lot of questions and a lot of conversation, and I think ultimately it's been good for the community.
Yeah, definitely. I know one of the questions that I've heard, or at least I don't know if you've heard, but how with the diversity project you're including race and sexuality and gender, but how some might look at it and think, well, how does this affect those who are cis, or we'll just say, straight, white, male, who are just underperformed composers already? Does it help them, or does it somehow, push back against them since they're part of that, canonical, whatever, idea of composers?
Right. So one of the reasons why I decided to get into this in the first place was because that I had, over time and just through experience, realized that while it may have seemed at the time that there were a lot of women composers out there, there really weren't as many as what's the best way to put this? Well, because it's a little confusing because there were a lot of women composers out there,
right?
But and this, I'm thinking there were, meaning like say 15 years ago or even 10 years ago, there have been, almost for at least 100 years, I would say, maybe more, there have been a lot of women composing And I know that there are studies about women in the 19th century. You know, they were also composing, but they were composing things that wouldn't necessarily get noticed by, you know, the Boston Symphony or something like that because of reasons.
Right.
But the problem is that the amount that they were being programmed was much less than the others. The number that I kept coming up with over time, looking at my own studies as well as those studies that were done by the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra and others over time, is usually about 2% of, say, season or a catalog or something along those lines. That number kept coming up, sometimes a little less, sometimes a little more, but 2% just kind of came up over and over again. And at that point I was kind of like, that's not cool.
Yeah.
I'm sure probably people are like, oh, here's this white guy going, that's not cool. That it probably should have like that. But I don't mean for it. Yeah, I'm just going to step in it anyway. But the idea of like, that is an issue that needs to be addressed, because my experience, having worked with a lot of younger composers over time, is, you know, I was guessing that probably, because there's no way, and I've had plenty of people ask, how do we find out how many women composers there actually are versus, like, you know, all of the living composers? And I'm like, there's I don't know. There's no way, there's no really strong way to be able to do that. I've had people ask me, go to ASCAP, go to BMI, get the numbers. They're not going to give me the numbers because they don't even ask your gender when you apply for ASCAP or BMI.
Right.
Right. So they don't even have that.
Yeah.
But the idea of 2% seems so low as to be like, look, that's being artificially held down.
Yeah.
So for so many reasons, and so many, like, you can't just say one thing is the thing that causes it all. But I knew, at least from my own experience, that a lot of it was knowledge and access. They didn't know who the composers were, and they didn't know how to be able to access the composers and their works. The websites were out there, but, you know, even if you went to one of these sites where you just had a list of names, that's like searching for a needle in a haystack. Oh, I hope I can find someone who's written a cool string quartet in this list of hundreds of women composers, right?
Yeah, it's daunting if you do it that way.
Exactly. And so that's kind of how this whole thing kind of came about. So in terms of the impact on living composers who are cis white male, we have not yet done a study on that yet, but part of that is because we just haven't, we're still doing that. I'd love to be able to do, let's say for orchestra, I'd love to be able to do a longitudinal study for like the last 5 or 6 years and kind of see where all of those different demographics, how it's changed over the last, say, 6 years. Same with wind band, same with choir. So maybe in 2 years, I'll be able to tell people this is what the impact is. But we're still so new, and we're still like building all of these things. It's going to take a while. And everybody wants to have the information like right away. And I'm like, it takes an enormous amount of time to be able to get all of this information and put it into a mechanism by which it can be used easily and found easily. And you try your best not to make sure that you've dotted your I's and crossed your T's, but also you haven't done things in a way that's going to be problematic.
Yeah.
And you try your best and then find, oh no, shouldn't have done that. All right, well, let's try and fix that. And then we go from there. But in terms of like, if I had, let's say, a group of 10 white cis male composers, in front of me and asking me, why are you doing this? And you're having an impact on our careers. And I'm kind of like, yeah, but think of what these folks who belong to these underrepresented groups have had to deal with. Like, they've been dealing with a lot more than that for a lot longer.
Yeah.
And I know that may sound a little goofy coming from a cis white guy who has actually been doing it enough, even though, like, yes, I know it's not like I'm having a thriving compositional career. I have a good compositional career. I'm never going to win a Pulitzer Prize or a Guggenheim or anything like that, but I like to think that there are folks who like to play my music from time to time.
Yeah.
But this has become something that I don't see it necessarily as a calling, but it is a place where my time and talents seem to be helping. And so that's why I'm doing it.
Yeah. I mean, I have to admit that with the kind of basis of what our show is, I've heard back from a few people who said something similar about, like, well, why do you have to go find instruments or find people from around the world that, you know, people might not know and their music, and talk to them and things. And when there's plenty of people in Houston who haven't, you know, it's like, well, it's true, but everyone deserves an equal share at the table, you know. And for those who don't have that opportunity, this is another way, another avenue, at least we might be able to highlight their abilities.
Yeah.
So.
Man, absolutely. Oh, that's just such a gorgeous sentiment. I was, listening to you speak, and I'm thinking, like, man, I wish I would have had this database and, like, when I was going to school, and and I'm so excited that it exists. I was like, I didn't hear you say the dates at first, and I was like, man, did, like, my professors not know about this? What the hell? And then I'm like, oh, okay, I'd already been out of school by the time all this had come out. But I'm so excited for younger generations. I'm a female composer, and I did my undergrad at the University of Montana, and I remember just my professors saying to me, like, you need to go listen to more music. But I was from a rural community. I also grew up in Houston, but also small town Montana. And I was like, I just had no idea. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I didn't know how to go find out. And I remember just feeling like punished in a way of like, well, I guess I'll start with Beethoven or Bach. And then they're yelling at me to listen to more contemporary people. And I'm like, I don't know. So I'm so excited to hear just about this project. And I think this is going to have just an enormous impact on, everyone that studies composition, not only the cis white males, but the females and the people of color. And I'm so excited to see where this goes. I don't know, in 10 years, I can't even imagine. So thank you for your work. This is just amazing.
Oh, well, and thank you. I mean, it's what you just mentioned is really kind of where I've been coming from at it, because I grew up it wasn't a small town. It was a college town out in the cornfields. But I remember very vividly, trying not to sound too old, but pre-internet, if you wanted to find music, you either had to be lucky enough that the record store in your town happened to get whatever they happened to get, either cassette tapes or LPs, even before or CDs came in, or you had to go into Chicago, and so I would, every few months I would be lucky enough to be able to get into Chicago and go to Tower Records or Rose Records or Virgin Records and go see, what kind of recordings can I find here that I couldn't find back in my hometown. And I remember one of the other aspects of that I think really kind of has resonated with this whole thing is how our current way that people tend to find music is by online media, be it Spotify, be it YouTube, take your pick. Challenge with those things is that it does not let you browse very well.
Right.
Because of the algorithm that it's showing you. It's a little bit easier for you to search, and if you can find something via search, that's one thing. But still, even the search, you kind of have to filter through their algorithms when you're going through there, as opposed to back in the day, going through a music library, going through a record store, and literally just thumbing through and discovering things that you wouldn't have normally come across.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something really, really special about being able to do that we can't really do today as much as we normally would be able to. And so that's part of the reason why something like this, where you can do a search for, hopefully, you can't do this right. Well, we'll talk about, like, let's say a band piece. You can actually do a search for a band piece by a living woman composer. And I don't know, let's say, and in someone based in the state of California, for those of you who are in California. And then you can actually just go and discover things, as opposed to like a laser beam trying to find the thing. No, I love the idea of providing the opportunity to discover, not to have a thumb on the scale.
Mm-hmm.
Like, obviously, the last person to be a gatekeeper, and I've really tried hard to make sure that, even to the point where one of the things that we discovered, several months ago, at the beginning of the summer, I think, was like, wait a minute, all of our searches, when you do a search and the results come up, they're in alphabetical order for the works database.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, that is in and of itself biasing against anyone whose name ends with W or T, right? You're never going to get to them, just in terms of the way that people search, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then we fixed that, and then we actually didn't realize until several months later that, the composer diversity database, we forgot to do that too. So, it's been kind of, building the plane as we fly it. But just simple things like that, to be able to kind of do a search and then just allow it to randomize what the results are, to make sure that you're not allowing that organizational part of our brain unwittingly bias us against certain composers because where they happen to end up on a list.
Right.
So that idea of, I guess, short story long, this that's whole idea of allowing for discovery is something that I think is really fun and is one of the big kind of underlying foundational components of this.
Oh, that's amazing. I kind of remember my first year at the University of Montana, I kind of did something similar where I remember going to, I think it was a Hastings, and being like, okay, I need to find classical music, because I'm just like, they had like the tiniest little section, and I think I bought like some adagios for strings or something because that's what sold and was on the shelf. And I remember thinking like, okay, there's got to be something better out there. And that was even before, I think, like Spotify was just launching, and like it hardly had grasped the classical world that I love their classical library now, but it was like that just wasn't a thing. And then I think I tried Naxos and was like completely lost in Naxos. So that's just, I love that idea of being able to browse and just see what's out there and kind of, throw in a couple search parameters so that your brain kind of knows what's going on. And no, that's so cool.
So I do want to ask you about your interview with the African Composers YouTube. Is that okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
So they had a good questions about labels when it came to how you categorize things. Did it make you think about how the labels of the composer database might affect its success outside of like the European, Western, Caucasian normative?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it was that was a fascinating conversation that I enjoyed so much.
She was fascinating.
She's wonderful, and no, it was really a lot of fun to think about looking at this through different lenses, and I think one of the things that we kind of have to keep in mind is that something that has come up continually kind of throughout this entire project is that we can't be everything to all people, right? At some point you have to make a decision of like, all right, it can't be it can't be that comprehensive, because that can kind of wrap around itself,
Right.
where it's going in two directions at the same time, and then that's less useful, let's say.
Yeah.
And so I think ultimately, for right now, I would say that, we're trying to deal with music, the concert music scene, but also the music education scene. And does it have an American bent to it? Sure, of course. We're all American. We are all, it is based here in the United States. Everyone who's working on it is American. So that just kind of, at this point, in the first few years of its existence, it makes sense to kind of at least allow for it to have that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
How to be able to address those questions, I think definitely they should be addressed, and how is going to be, again, one of those slow, organic processes, because it's really easy to be like, okay, this person said we need to do this, so then we'll do that, and then that person said we need to do this, and then we do it, and the next thing you know, you're playing whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
All the time, right? And it has been a real challenge, because sometimes people are like, no, you need to do the thing, and I'm like, well, yeah, and I get that, yes, but there are other sides to this, and I've been trying to be as neutral about it as I can, in terms of both what physically and technologically what can we do, but then also what is the best way to do it. And I understand that I'm coming at it from a point of privilege and a place of privilege, not only being the person who started it, but also who I am and where I am and all of those things. Just trying to do the best thing for as many people as possible. And so I think it is really good to keep that in mind. But at the same time, I think for the most part, the folks who are using it, the way that it's currently structured, and it still needs some additions. We've got a few categories that we need to add. We need to add things like indigenous cultures from outside of American Indian and Alaska Native. We definitely need to add something like Pacific Islander or Oceania, something along those lines. Those are things that basically, just because back when we were putting this together, we just weren't finding anybody from those places, but now we have. And so now we need to be able to fix that. So it's still going to be fluid, and it will kind of ebb and flow, I think. But at the same time, the idea of still kind of keeping it within a certain direction, for at least for now, seems to be the best way to go about it. But it brings up a really good question in terms of the original thing was to create the composer database, right? Because that was kind of like, that's where it started, is just finding the composers. Mm-hmm. And I would say kind of, it will take a while, but I think the importance of that component of it will lessen the more that we can get the works databases up and running, because ultimately the composer database is what's driving the works databases. So you can first you find the composers, then you find what they've written, and then you put those into the different databases, right? And ultimately, because the focus is primarily on those performers and conductors and educators and the people who are looking for the repertoire, with that focus on better programming, that the works databases will really be, I think, the ultimate goal is to have those. That's where you're focused on, and then you need the composer database in order to help drive those. So obviously the demographics and the terminology that we use, we're trying our best to be able to figure out what's the best way to be able to make it work, where it is both useful for folks who are looking for repertoire, but at the same time is still respectful for the composers who are in the database. And that takes a while, because that's not a simple, oh, you just do this, done. So it is a process, and we're still going through it. But I think we're getting a lot closer, and we're actually making some changes in terms of, especially how LGBTQ composers are represented in the database. That's another one that has been thorny for many reasons, and we're slowly trying to figure out the best way to be able to make it work, both for the folks who are using the search interface as well as the information that will be coming out. So that's still in the process of getting worked on, but I would say probably by the beginning of next year, things will be looking a lot better in that way.
Well, and y'all are only not even 2 years old officially as the Institute, so I mean, it's just a baby, So,
and a volunteer baby at that. Everybody has their own full-time jobs, and then everybody's helping us with this stuff on the side. And it is good, but I think it can be and will be a lot better.
The criticism you've received just really speaks to the potential of the project, because I think we tend to get, when we find something that we like, we go, oh my God, okay, I need to remake this and do it in my vision. So I think it's a huge compliment to the Institute itself, because you've started this thing that's going to mean so many things to so many people, and it's going to be really cool to see how that all grows. But hopefully the criticism can keep you guys on track or won't get in the way of. It's
ultimately it's good for us to be able to hear these concerns and to be able to kind of figure out, for instance, just what I was mentioning before in terms of the search interface. For the longest time, kind of just on a very technical nuts and bolts way of thinking, for the longest time we were just like, well, we need, these spreadsheets, you have people and all of their information in rows, and then you have columns, and the columns correlated to the search interface. So you'd have a button, and that would tell you jazz or opera or city or one of those things. Mm-hmm. And that would correlate to a column that's in the database. So for the longest time, we always just assumed that, you only have the number of columns that you need for the search interface, and then whatever's there goes up into the response information pages or the cards that come up. And it's only been, I would say, in the last 2 or 3 months when we've been talking about it, that we've started to figure out, wait a minute, no, we could have extra columns that don't correlate to search buttons, but then when they come up, we can provide additional information. So things like, say, pronouns. One of the reasons why we didn't do pronouns for folks who belong to the LGBTQ plus community was that the idea of, why would someone be searching for someone with a particular pronoun? Mm-hmm. And that was just kind of a mental block in all of our, those of us who were working on it. Like, no, why, yes, it is an important thing, but why would someone search for it? Until we figured out, wait a minute, we could have that as an information column in the database. It just doesn't need to have a button that that someone is searching for. But when they are searching for someone who belongs to that community, when it comes up, once we're able to get these changes put together, then the card that comes up would be able to have that information.
See, okay.
So, right. And so again, it's this thing of like, and people will be like, why aren't you doing this? I'm like, how does like I can tell you, but it wouldn't. I'm not. It was. Let's just say I've just been swimming in a vat of awkward for a very long time. But I think it has. I think ultimately it's like, no, these are important things, and then to figure out how to be able to make it work, and then to be able to get it out in a timely manner is always going to be challenging. But I think now we have a lot more people who are working on it, who are invested in it, and so I think those changes will come about, and hopefully over time, folks will embrace what we're doing.
See, so I know this kind of happens sometimes. When I was working on my dissertation, it was on hip hop music and the rap music scene, and especially internationally. And I found that as I was doing research, people started asking me a whole bunch of questions about it and things that I really didn't necessarily know. Do you feel like since you started this and it's kind of starting to grow, that people automatically assume that you're some sort of like authority of knowledge or of this racial equality and things?
Yeah, and in some ways, I think so. I think it's easy for folks to be like, "Oh, he's running the diversity database thing, so he must be an expert in all of the things." And I'm like, "No, I'm totally not an expert in all of the things." You know, I'm very much not. I'd like to think that I do have some expertise in terms of just both kind of knowing who more composers are, just to kind of and trying to be a liaison or a middle person between what performers and conductors and educators need, kind of because of my background in music ed and conducting and performing. So like I can kind of understand how they're coming at it and how they make, going back to those decision-making processes, how they make their programming decisions. And then trying to like, okay, here's what you would need in order to fix those, but then also to ask why. And this is a good kind of transition into why. Because it's one thing, and it's one thing just to say, okay, you've checked off all your boxes. You are now performing an appropriate number of works by composers from underrepresented groups. And I agree with everyone who says that is not what we should be doing. And I totally agree. That is not how folks should be going about this. Obviously, they need to be thinking of who the composers are, and then they should be performing their works because the music is good, because it resonates with them, because they think it will resonate with both the performers and the audiences. All of the reasons why you would perform any other works. Primarily, this is providing access to works that you might not have known about. That's pretty much it. But my own experience working with young composers has also kind of fed into this. And I know full well that even just from my own description of my own background as a composer back in the day, no one told me that I could be a composer when I was growing up. And I'm a white guy, right? And I'm sure Hillary probably had a similar situation, but maybe even more so. And if you think about someone who is from any of these other underrepresented groups, the challenges for young musicians from those groups to imagine themselves as composers is really challenging.
Yeah.
And it is my hope from Rob the composer point of view that the more works that are being performed from all of these different underrepresented groups will normalize it to the point where 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, you have kids in middle school and in high school and in college that's just like, well, of course I could become a composer because we've been playing works and I've been hearing works by people who are like me.
Mm-hmm.
And then what will happen? Then we get more composers. And then you get more, right? You'll get more composers from those groups. And then over time, working the system from both top and bottom, like the people who are making the programming decisions, and then also increasing the number of people who are actually creating music, creating art, bringing their own voices to the table. It's then, looking long term, one would hope that would really have an impact in terms of our art form and all of the things.
Holy cow. Yeah. No, that representation's so vital. Yeah, I remember when I originally went into engineering and was just not loving it. Was doing really well, but was not loving it. And I remember thinking, like, seeing that composition was on the U of M's website, and I was like, oh my gosh, people still do this? Like, because I mean, like, you only heard of, like, all I had grown up with was Mozart, and my mom was a pianist and she was always playing these works, and it just had never occurred to me that, like, oh, people still write music, like. So yeah, or like in that style especially. I mean, of course, you have your radio and stuff like that, but no, that's just so cool. That representation is going to be amazing as it starts to really kick off and keep going.
I hope so.
Yeah, I know it's one of the things that I see a lot, especially here, is I heard from her story from Cassidy Reed, is that she said representation equals realization. So and it's just that idea. I had never really thought about it either, but I was thinking what was it like being as a kid, thinking about being a composer and thinking, well, Stravinsky's dead and Mahler's dead and Copland just died like 2 years ago and Bernstein's gone. So, I mean, who else is really out there? There can't be that many people, and even though in our town we had like a composer who was teaching at our university, but he did mostly the conducting, and so we didn't really. But again, he was over 60, and we're just like, it's old. And
well, and of course, it's fascinating now in 2020 because it's so easy for students to get involved in composing because of notation software and GarageBand and all of the different opportunities that, to be honest, 30 years ago when I was doing this and just kind of getting started, when I was doing my big band charts, I was writing them out by hand with a pencil and paper, and I would be staying up all night in the all night diner writing parts out for a week. Because that's what you did.
Yeah.
And it was really, really hard. In order to hear the piece, you actually had to write the whole thing out and hand it to your friends and then listen to it. And now, 30 years later, we have the technology where folks can pick that stuff up much more quickly. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's so many things that we still need to deal with in terms of composition pedagogy and making sure that folks understand the creative process and all of that. But those roadblocks are no longer there. Mm-hmm. So now it's like, okay, you have access to the tools, but you still need to have the it's one thing for a teacher to say, hey, you can do this. Mm-hmm. But it's another thing for it to be shown through modeling. Mm-hmm. That modeling can only really be done through repertoire that the students are playing, that the students are hearing. it's the same thing with conducting and performing. Same exact thing. The more, say, conductors of color or women conductors there are, the more chance you are to inspire others from those groups to be able to do the same thing, and then the numbers grow, and then there you go. So it's a long process, but I think it's a good one. So.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
do you see the database ever, like, as you get older, are you going to keep working on it till the day you die and, like, you know, on your deathbed be like, I got to put one more date in? Or are you going to be, no, here, you're 40 years younger, take the baton, you know?
Oh my goodness. Oh, there's the question. Well, 4 years ago, I didn't know I was going to be doing this in the first place. So. To be perfectly honest, I have no idea. It is one of those things where I recognize that it is associated with me now, and I'd like to think that I have some good things to say about it, and some good things to say in terms of the directionality of it. But obviously, no. There's nothing special about me that, like, oh, it can't run without me. No, there's plenty of people who could run with it. And so in terms of when and how, at what point do I step away? At this point, I don't know, but we'll just probably recognize it when it comes. The interesting thing is that it's not really something that I need to do. Like, I'm not.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Your livelihood isn't based on it.
I'm not making any money off of it.
Yeah.
I'm not, like, I'm getting notoriety, but notoriety doesn't do that much. And to be honest, I'm getting a fair amount of notoriety on both sides of the continuum. So that's kind of a wash. I didn't really do this in order to make my name, because I was doing that in a lot of different other arenas. And so really this is something that, for whatever reason, I just decided, hey, this would be useful for the world. Why don't I at least get it started? And then we'll just kind of go from there. And over time, especially I would say in the last 6 months, more and more people, for all of the reasons, the fact that folks have had a little bit more time on their hands because of the pandemic over the summer, as well as a heightened sense of awareness of the situation because of George Floyd and everything that's been happening in our society since June. There's been more and more folks who have been willing to come in and volunteer their time and really invest themselves into the concept. And hopefully over time, it can get to the point where I'm doing less of the big pushing of the stuff, and then it's just kind of a bunch of folks who are doing it. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the future, I'd like to think that, you know, it could be something like I don't know, we've been talking about comparing it to like a library or IMSLP or something like that, right? So it's there and it continues to happen. But ultimately it's something like, it's a resource just like anything else that it's continually growing and building. But I think hopefully once the newness of the thing, of the whole concept, wears away, and it allows folks to just use it on a regular basis because that's what you should do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. Just like in any other, it's just another tool that you use, just like all of the other tools that we would use in those circumstances. So at least that's what's popping into my head today in this Saturday afternoon. I don't really, obviously I haven't really planned out what the next 10 or 20 years are going to be, but that's kind of where I'd like to see it, something that's stable and, it's continually getting better. But ultimately it's going to be something that once we're able to get at least the main databases up and running, then it's kind of there. Like it's still in the midst of being built. Once it gets to that kind of critical mass where it's now a thing, then it can kind of move forward under its own volition.
And then you're going to be off to the next idea. Seems to be the pattern. Like 5 years from now, you're going to be on a new project.
He's going to be out there finding the cruise ship composers.
No, actually, if anything, one of the things that, you know, and I haven't really told anybody else this, but one of the things that I've always wanted to do is something completely different, which has to do with instrumentation.
Oh.
I've taught my instrumentation and orchestration classes a number of times, and I've always really gotten enjoyment of trying to figure out how how our modern instruments have kind of evolved over the last thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And the cultures from where they came from. Like, we tend to think of, there are instruments that we tend to think of as like, oh, those are European, white people instruments. And you're like, no, actually that came from the Middle East, or no, that actually came over here. Yeah. And to be able to come up with a way to be able to, I don't know, kind of explain how our music, even what we think of as Western art music, mm-hmm. has so many connections to outside cultures. Like, even the things that we think of as kind of like the building blocks of our Western European culture are not a granite block that is entirely and only from, Western Europe.
Yes.
Right.
I'm hurting my ego. No, I'm just kidding.
But to be able to think of how that works just from how the instruments evolved, and even to think of it from a composer standpoint, we tend to think of the composers as driving the bus on musical innovation, mm-hmm. like harmonic innovation or something like that. Mm-hmm. But there's so many reasons why, like, music in the middle of the 19th century suddenly got a lot more chromatic, and it had nothing to do with the fact that all of the instruments that they were writing for, especially in like larger ensembles, were suddenly chromatic and not just playing on like the harmonic series of whatever crook they happen to be playing on. So, right? I mean, and those are the types of things. Yeah, I love the idea of kind of turning something like that on your head, and thinking about like, oh wait, no, maybe like maybe it was the person who invented these valves on the brass instruments that had an effect, and the fact that the woodwind instruments finally got to be able to be played in tune in all 12 keys, mm-hmm. because it was so hard to do back in, say, just 50 or 100 years previous. Then the composers finally had the ability to be able to write music, and then to imagine, well, what would have happened if Mozart and Haydn had those instruments at their disposal. So, not to go off on a completely different tangent, but yes, there's plenty of other things, plenty of other projects that at some point I'd love to be able to tackle in my spare time. But for right now, this might take a little while.
So we just want to thank you so much for being on our podcast and giving everyone the insights and the details about the Institute Composers Diversity. So I guess the only question I have is, if someone is that would like to be involved, either volunteering or even just maybe submitting themselves to be included, how should they go about doing that?
Yeah, well, first off, I would love to thank you both, William and Hillary, for having me on, and I very much appreciate being able to have these conversations. It's awesome. If anyone's interested in getting involved or submitting their works or submitting themselves into our database, just go to composerdiversity.com. We have a contact page which allows folks to be able to contact us through there, as well as pages with submission forms for basically all of our different databases, as well as the composer database. So they can just find it all on the website.
Perfect. And we'll include that too. We'll include the link for that. Sorry, Hillary.
Cool.
And everything. So yeah. So thank you so much for being on.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Sounds of the World podcast. We hope you enjoyed the episode. There are links to everything in the episode description and also on our website.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Sounds of the World. To show support for Sounds of the World podcast, please join our Patreon, where you can have access to our after-party discussions with guests, discounted merchandise, and even more.
If you have any questions, answers, or episode suggestions, please email us at soundsoftheworldpodcast@gmail.com. Well, Bill, I think I'm going to go have a beer now.
Hey, there you go.